So
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spent. Take another look and take some time for hemp. Don't cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yeah, it's time for hemp. An acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rent. Well, it's time for hemp.
thank you for taking time for hemp. I'm your host, Casper Leach. You are listening to a special 2-hour broadcast of Time for Hemp with no commercial interruptions. This program has begun an hour earlier than its normal time slot. This is because we are bringing to the world a very special message. The message that we are bringing is the need to end prohibition. Over the years, there has been many congressional hearings and senatorial meetings that have been formed over a variety of topics, whether it be gun control or having problems with aspirin and sugar. But the problem of marijuana prohibition and the problem of prohibition has really never been formally addressed by experts sitting before Congress, the Senate, and the body of the UN. Time for Hemp has grown tired of waiting for that invitation, and we have organized a 5-part summit. And this is the 4th conference of those 5. And we are focusing today on how the criminal justice system has been impacted by prohibition. Leading off our discussions today, our first moderator, Peter Criss, co-founder of the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, has been nice enough to agree to join us today, and he will be introducing you to the other moderator, and together they will bring to you a panel of amazing people. Peter?
Yes, Casper, thank you very much, and I really appreciate you doing this. It gives a wonderful opportunity for people from within the system to talk about it. Today's show, we're going to have, just to give you a quick rundown, Steve Downing, retired Deputy Chief LAPD, Judge Leonard Frieling, a former judge from Colorado, Michael Cindrich, who was a prosecutor, Police Captain Neill Franklin, retired Maryland State Police, and U.S. Navy Intelligence Specialist Larry Talley. Some of them will be coming up in the second hour. Some of them will be in the first hour. In fact, even the ones that are in the first hour may be sticking around for the second hour. So if you're listening, I would listen to the whole 2 hours because it's well worth it. Joining me is co-moderator Sean Dunagan. Sean Dunagan is former DEA, and Sean will be asking the questions, and the rest of us will be in the conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sean.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and Casper, again, thank you for hosting this. It's certainly an important issue, as everyone here, and I hope everyone listening agrees. You know, one thing that strikes me listening to and reading over the bios of the panelists who will be joining us both in this hour and the second hour is it really could be a panel of instructors at FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, certainly on par with the instructors that I had at Quantico, certainly on par with the instructors at the FBI's National Academy for Senior Law Enforcement Executives, and certainly on par or exceeding the experience and expertise of people who have testified before Congress and before the UN in the past on drug policy issues and drug control issues. So it really is a great event, and I thank you very much for hosting this. So with that, everybody here, all of our panelists have spent a lot of time and effort following distinguished law enforcement and legal careers and trying to educate the public about the drug war and advocating for reform. So I'd like to open it up with sort of an open question. What do you wish that more people knew about the war on drugs? And I guess we'll get it started with Leonard Frieling, if you would.
Good morning. I am thrilled to say that I'm speaking a little in advance of Peter, which is always an easier position. What do I, as a LEAP speaker, want the public to know about the war on drugs? Okay, let's start at the top. First, it is a misnomer. It is not a war on drugs. It is a war on people. You can't have a war on oil. You can have a war about oil, over oil, fueled by oil. It's the same thing with drugs. So it's a war on people. Now, who are those people? Well, first, everyone south of the U.S. border to about where the ice starts. It's a war on them. Then it's a war on our U.S. citizens who are illegally in the underground drug business one way or another. And then it's a war on our U.S. citizens who have the bad fortune to being at the wrong end of a SWAT team raid at the wrong address, where they shoot the dog and the old lady has a heart attack. And the officers are very sorry, but after all, there might have been a meth lab there, but oops, wrong address. So it's really a war on our people by our government. We can't have that. Our people don't need to tolerate that. This is America. So that would be the single most important thing I would want people to figure out about the war on drugs. The second biggest thing, and then I'll pass the mic. The second biggest thing is, however you name it, however you describe it, however you look at it, it is not, cannot, will not ever be won. It is an unworkable model. It is an unworkable paradigm. The only thing guaranteed is the future income of private prisons, of, for example, DEA agents that need to be repurposed. I think those are the key things that strike me at the moment.
Great, thank you. And would anyone else like to chime in on that open question? What you wish more people knew about the war on drugs?
This is Steve Downing speaking. It's really a subject that could take hours and hours and hours and hours of examination, discussing what the harms of the war on drugs as compared to the harm of the drugs themselves. I've, over the years, compiled a list that goes to the harms of our communities. But before we get to the harms of our communities, it's the federal intervention, the federal use of federal dollars, of our taxpayer dollars, to leverage local law enforcement to do the job that they want to do. And so way away in Washington, we have these bureaucrats who have no sense of what true public safety is, and they have used our tax money to divert local law enforcement away from true public safety, away from true community policing, away from being peace officers, and turn them into drug warriors, finance them with military equipment and grants and all sorts of incentives that have drawn our police agencies into this arena that we call policing for profit. And the result of that is the escalation of the war on drugs, or as Lenny said, the war on the people, which it is, a war on the people. And so we've incarcerated 43 million people over the last 40 years, and we branded them as felons and as drug offenders, and we've denied them jobs, housing, educational opportunities. And by doing that, we've unraveled the social fabric of our communities. We take fathers and mothers from homes. We create foster children. We have created a burgeoning, totally corrupt drug treatment bureaucracy across the United States. Just a few weeks ago in the Los Angeles area, CNN revealed that there's 59 drug treatment centers that are totally corrupt. They bring in people from group foster homes who have never used a drug, who have never been exposed to a drug, and they use them as little puppets to charge the county for drug treatment. So the harms of the war on drugs extend into every thread of our society. There is nothing that it doesn't touch that's not harmful. There is no metric that says the war on drugs has been successful.
Unless you own stock in a prison industrial complex.
That's true.
That's right. It's it's striking, and thank you for the answers. It's striking that we're having this conversation on a show called Time for Hemp, and yet I don't believe the word marijuana has been uttered yet. It's interesting. Of course, there's been a dramatic shift in public opinion regarding marijuana, the decriminalization or even legalization of both medical and recreational use of marijuana in recent years. But LEAP's position really goes further than that. To include regulated legalization of all drugs. And I was wondering, how would you explain to somebody the rationale of why legalize drugs other than marijuana? And Mike, I guess since you joined LEAP a couple of years ago, I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, so the perspective on marijuana as opposed to other drugs, is that your question?
Yes. Yeah. Why? There's great public support for the decriminalization, at least, or legalization of marijuana, but less so for the legalization or decriminalization of other drugs. So, what about LEAP's position is attractive to you?
Yeah, I think really what it comes down to is whether it's marijuana or other drugs, we're not necessarily looking at the drug, we're looking at the impact that prohibition has on society. And I think whether you're talking about marijuana, cocaine, LSD, no matter what it is, there are different issues that are going to arise with personal consumption, with sale, a lot of different areas related to those specific drugs. But I think what it really comes down to is, how society is handling this prohibition and what the costs are to society. I mean, I think kind of going back to your last question a little bit, one thing about the war on drugs is it's fueled by demand. And I think prohibition in our country has increased the demand for street-level drugs, which in turn has increased the supply of those drugs and the manufacturing of those drugs in other countries. I think if you go down to some of the South American countries, you speak to those leaders, they're going to tell you that if you didn't have such a large demand for drugs in the United States and other developed countries, then you're not going to see this organized crime really flourishing in these underdeveloped countries. And I think that's a really important point to take away from this. But really, I think just the prohibition in general. One thing that we look at, and one thing that I've seen come up in many different conversations, and it's a solid point that LEAP makes, is that as when you have these street level drugs that are unregulated. That's what causes the problems. This is what's causing deaths. You can't, heroin, for example, you don't know the different cuts. You don't know how strong it is. People are going out there and dying. And, and then on the other side of it, we're turning these addicts into criminals, essentially, and locking them up in cages. And the prisons are, it's a revolving door. People are going in, they're coming out, they're not getting any treatment, they're not getting any rehabilitation. When they get back out on the streets, they're going and using drugs again. And if they can't afford those drugs, they're going to commit crimes in order to get those drugs. So I think that, really, whether it's marijuana or any of these other drugs, it's just a failed system. And, we really need some change. And I think LEAP is a great organization, and it brings a lot of credibility having former law enforcement officers, current and former law enforcement, supporting this position.
Yeah, it's interesting. And yes, for those that are worried about it, I'm going to mention it. When we formed LEAP in the beginning, we named it Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Now, we didn't name it Law Enforcement Against Marijuana Prohibition or Drug Prohibition. We named it Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And it goes to exactly what Mike was just saying. When you have consenting adults that want to do something together, whether it's buy and sell drugs or whatever, and you make that banned, you prohibit it, you create crime in your society out of things that had no victims, really. They weren't doing it to other people. They were just doing it amongst themselves. And if there is money connected to that activity, you also create violence in your streets, because if those people have a dispute over the money, they have no access to the court system to settle that dispute, so they take it to the streets. So LEAP, on a much broader term, is really addressing the idea. In fact, it's perfect, and I'm glad Steve used the two terms. We talked about police officers and peace officers. The difference between those two is policing is running around and checking and making everything sure everybody's doing it right and all that other stuff. Peace officers are called in when the peace is disturbed and restore peace. That's what our job was. That's what we were trained to do. And that's in a free society. The only thing we should be doing is settling disputes between combating people, not trying to prevent people from doing what they choose to do. Just another point of view.
Yeah, and it really comes down to the right for the individual to choose what's best for their own body, and it shouldn't be the government telling us what we can and can't put in our body. And when it comes down to it, you're putting drug offenders in cages with murderers, rapists, and some of the most violent people in our society, and it's just unbelievable that we're still in this day and age that we're still doing that. And I see it on a daily basis with clients I'm representing in the criminal courts here in San Diego, California. It's a shame to see that we're locking drug offenders up. In some cases, it's addictions. In some cases, it's just people that are trying to make a living, and people that they're selling to are consenting adults. People that have decided that, hey, I want to do this. I'm choosing whether it's marijuana or another substance over alcohol or over another way to relax or wind down at the end of the day. But in the end, we're locking these people up, and it just doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Mike. It's interesting. I think there's if not a consensus, certainly a large percentage of the public that would agree that treating individual addicts as criminals is wrong and not very productive and not a good way to approach the drug problem writ large. But that raises the question of decriminalization, right? I mean, we could cease arresting low-level drug users and addicts by implementing just decriminalization, right? It becomes a civil violation or a minor infraction, a traffic ticket, rather than a criminal charge. So, do you see that decriminalization as opposed to regulated legalization? Are there any advantages to that? Are there any disadvantages to that approach?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump in real quick and remind everybody that alcohol prohibition was decriminalization. We didn't arrest users. We just arrest the manufacturers and the producers and the sellers. So that didn't work real well then. I don't think it'll work any better now. But
in fact, it is the single best thing we could possibly do for the drug cartels, because what we're saying is all of your customers can more safely, legally use your product. But we'll guarantee that we, the government, will keep your price nice and high by keeping it illegal, so the underground supply train isn't hurt at all. They're assisted because their customers can be more at ease knowing that it's just decriminalized as opposed to a class 4 felony. I think it does the precise opposite of what it's intended to do in thinking.
There's a program in Vancouver, British Columbia, where they allow the addict to bring the black market purchase dope into a clinic where they shoot up. So that's a tiny form of decriminalization. The result of that program has been that even though they might get bad dope on the street, if they overdose, their lives are saved. There's been a 50% reduction in HIV infection in that area. And in that immediate region, there has been a decrease in the kinds of crimes that you would call addict crimes. So that part of the program should prove to our government that we can deal with the addicts very effectively. And another advantage of that program is that more addicts are voluntarily entering treatment than those that are put in treatment through the criminal justice system. So the program should prove to our government that this is a good way to treat addicts. This is a good way to contribute to a vital community, but at the same time, you have left in place the black market, which is delivering all of the violence, because that black market, Coors and Budweiser don't shoot it out on the street for distribution territory.
Well, in Colorado,
Coors in Colorado, and you never hear of anyone selling Jim Beam on the school grounds. So, if we add to that the regulation, control, and full legalization, you're going to take care of both ends of this problem, and you're going to do it in a way that's less expensive to the taxpayer.
Yeah,
Yeah, you mentioned expense, right? And earlier, both you and Lenny mentioned money and the drug war. And, of course, one of the places where money and drugs and government kind of meet is with civil and asset forfeiture. And I was wondering if you could, if any of you would address that issue, kind of walk through the process, how it works, what a civil forfeiture is, and what role it's had in kind of perpetuating the drug war.
Let me give the Colorado 30-second nutshell. The state comes in, does a drug bust. They bring the feds in to seize all property thought to have been purchased by drug money and all property to facilitate the manufacture, distribution of drugs, and basically every bit of property they can get. The feds seize it in federal court in a civil action and then kick back a percentage to the state that let the feds handle the forfeiture.
Let me give you an example here in California. This is a story, and this story is repeated time and time and time and time again by the Holder Department of Justice. The city of Anaheim, they don't want marijuana dispensaries, but it's legal in California. The people voted 55% to have marijuana dispensaries. So the city, who is subordinate, chartered by the state, sovereign, instead of going to the state to resolve their problems, they run to the federal government, the DEA and the DOJ. So the DOJ isn't going to prosecute the medical marijuana dispensary because they're going to open up again somewhere. So what they're doing now is they're seizing property from landowners. And Anaheim, this man and wife, they're full retirement, a dentist and an engineer. They own a building, commercial building, worth $1.5 million. They were asked to rent space to a medical marijuana dispensary. They checked everything to do with the medical marijuana dispensary. Legal across the board. They ensured that it was. They had lawyers look at it. They read Holder's statements about medical marijuana. They read all of the edicts that were put out by the government. They listened to Obama. They were assured that they were renting to a legal enterprise. They rented to the dispensary. The DOJ, at the request of Anaheim, without notice, with no prior letter, seized their building under civil asset forfeit seizure. Now, we got to understand this. Anaheim also knows that if they're successful, they're going to get 80% of that 1.5 million for city coffers. And if you look across the country, you'll see that these local cities and local police departments are bringing in millions and millions and millions of dollars every year under civil asset seizure. One more example of the leverage the federal government has provided. One more example of policing for profit. They're seizing cars, they're seizing buildings. Now, these people, when they were served the seizure, they immediately ejected the dispensary tenants. The DOJ is continuing with that prosecution, civil. And there's nothing that shows that those people purchased that building with criminal proceeds. They merely rented one of several locations in their building to a medical marijuana dispensary. That's what our United States government is doing. That is the tyranny that holders DOJ is delivering to our communities and our people who are that have a property for their retirement and other means of support.
Yeah, just a quick comment on it. I just want to make some clarification for the people that are listening. There are two types of forfeitures that we do in this society. One is called criminal forfeiture, and that is if you are arrested and charged and then convicted of a crime and you have proceeds from that crime that you were convicted of, the government can seize those proceeds because you were convicted of the crime. Then we have what we're mainly talking about here, and that's civil forfeiture. And just so everybody listening understands this, and Stephen just pointed it out very well, you do not even have to be charged with a crime. You don't have, in fact, in civil forfeiture, you have to prove that you're innocent. They don't have to prove that you're guilty of anything. They just seize your property. And I think that is horrendous in a free society.
That's correct, Peter. And it's another example of, in my opinion, an unconstitutional intrusion on the sovereignty of states. Because in this case, this example I gave you, California has an asset seizure law. California has a civil asset seizure law, as a matter of fact. But the threshold of proof requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So in effect, it requires a criminal prosecution. The city of Anaheim refused to follow state law. They violated state sovereignty and went to the federal government. And under the asset seizure equitable sharing program of the federal government's civil asset seizure, 90% of all seizures under that program are drug related, and 80% of all seizures are unaccompanied by a criminal prosecution. And what they're doing is that they will surveil somebody, look at their property, find out, like in the case of these two people, their property is free and clear. There's an easy $1.5 million to pick up, and that's what they're doing. They're thugs. They're absolute thugs in doing this. And then they get on television, like our local DOJ guy, and he lies about what he's doing. He's saying, no, we're doing just what Obama said, and he's not. Because his people have publicly said that they're dedicated to wiping out every dispensary in California, even though they're legal.
In Colorado, we see something similar where we have a Colorado state forfeiture law, and I'm referring to the civil state forfeiture as opposed to the other one Peter described, criminal. The reason that Colorado has the feds do the seizing is that the federal forfeiture law gives the seizing authority extra powers and gives the victim less defenses than the state law does. So it's easier for it to be seized federally with the kickback system in Colorado.
Mike Cindrich here from San Diego. We see it here a lot as well with the dispensaries. We actually see, the federal involvement on a couple levels, but especially with the dispensaries, we call them smash and grab operations, because basically what's happening is, a group of 15 to 30 agents will hit up a dispensary. They'll detain individuals who are present on scene, but really what they're doing is they're looking for money, they're looking for product, they're looking for computers, other equipment that can be forfeited and sold, and basically the money's coming back to the feds and to the city law enforcement. So we're seeing that a lot, and very few prosecutions are coming out of these smash and grab style raids. But we're also seeing it with grow operations. What'll happen is San Diego Police Department will get a call about a grow. They'll come on scene. They find plants. First thing they do is they call the Narcotics Task Force. Now, the Narcotics Task Force is made up of both state and federal agents. So some of these agents are cross-sworn as DEA agents. And this takes a situation where if this is a legal grow under state law, and even if the grow gets cut down and equipment seized and marijuana seized, if we can succeed in state court in defending the action, then the defendant would be entitled to the return of their property and their equipment. Well, once the narcotics task force and these federal agents get involved, all bets are off pretty much as far as getting that equipment back, getting the marijuana back. So even if they succeed in state court, they still lost essentially their entire operation.
And think about what you're describing. You're talking about the major cause of armed home invasions in the United States. The armed home invasions in the United States are done by SWAT teams in drug cases, not by bad guys.
Exactly, and we see it all the time here in San Diego. And in a marijuana case recently, a case that I'm handling right now, my client and a couple of his buddies had 2 of their dogs shot. This was a no-knock raid. They basically opened the door, threw flash grenades in, came in, guns drawn, and 2 of the dogs got shot. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And my client said to the officers, he said, "Hey, all you guys needed to do was knock on the door. If you had a search warrant, we would have let you in. We would have let you search the whole place. You didn't have to come in like that." And especially, in a lot of these marijuana offenders. I mean, these are peaceful, nonviolent individuals, and this type of SWAT style, shooting dogs, it's just wholly unnecessary.
Well, this goes to the whole militarizing of police, which is a whole other thing, and this comes directly out of the drug war. And there's Randy Balco has got a new book out on that particular issue. I used to work with an old timer when I first started on the PD, and he used to say that if you're going to have in your society a military and a police, you should train the military on the East Coast and the police on the West Coast. They should never make contact with each other because they're so profoundly different jobs, but we have blended the 2 of them. And also, in everything that's being said here today, I said to my old department who started a drug unit a year after I left, and I was back there one day visiting, and they were going down through a list of stuff they were seized, and they were talking about the price they were going to sell it back to the guy they seized it from for. And I stood up and I said, "Oh boy, and they said, "Yeah, we know your drug stuff, Pete." I said, "No, not my drug stuff. I spent 20 years in this job, and it was a great job. It would have been a perfect job if we worked on commission, and now you guys are working on commission."
That's sad. Yeah,
well, it is. Stephen, your department, the LAPD, has unfortunately become one of the more militarized big city forces in the country. So I was wondering, your impression of what you hear Peter saying about the militarization of law enforcement, particularly as it pertains to the war on drugs.
Well, I'll say this: before all of this started, before all of this militarization imposed by the federal government started, the LAPD invented SWAT, and they invented SWAT operations for a very good reason, and that was to deal with highly volatile, highly dangerous situations that were beyond the capacity of first responders. And over the years, the LAPD has continued to train and deploy SWAT in a fashion that most of the rest of the country does not. For example, LAPD does not allow SWAT to serve search warrants unless there is a specific showing that the service of that search warrant involves a degree of danger and the possibility of weapons that are beyond the capacity of first responders or the serving entity to deal with. In LAPD, you do not see SWAT on the street in their SWAT clothes. You do not see the SWAT equipment rolling out of the barn in Los Angeles unless there is a legitimate SWAT call out that is evaluated by the commanders in SWAT, not the commanders on the street. They make the decision. So there are very rigorous uses of SWAT in the LAPD. And if SWAT was used across the country and managed like the LAPD manages SWAT, we wouldn't see a lot of dogs being shot. We wouldn't see SWAT going into medical marijuana dispensaries. We wouldn't see SWAT like they do in my little city, Long Beach, I see SWAT officers walking down the street in their fatigues with their big guns. At our Christmas parade in Long Beach, they brought out their tank and put it in the Christmas parade. And I told the chief of police later, I said, I felt like I was standing in Moscow's Red Square in Moscow, watching the big equipment roll by so that you could demonstrate to the people of Long Beach your military might. I said it made me sick. But the problem with this militarization is most of the time large major city organizations like LA, they know where to draw the line on the use of SWAT. But the federal government is handing out these tanks and these big guns and military equipment to every little podunk department and sheriff county across the country. I dealt with a case up in Oakdale, a 28-man police department with a SWAT team. You can't even select a SWAT team from a 28-man police department, much less train them. LAPD, out of 10,000, it's a force of 10,000 sworn personnel. They have 7 SWAT teams to cover the entire city, 18 divisions, around the clock. Those SWAT teams train 50% of their on-duty time. And that's why their success rate in handling situations without having to use force, without having to use weapons, they have an incredible record for coming out of situations without having to use deadly force. 95% of their incidents never result in the use of deadly force. But in these smaller jurisdictions across the country and towns like Long Beach, they're not managed correctly, and they take everything they can get from the federal government, even though the city might not be able to maintain that equipment. It takes a lot of time and personnel and expense to take care of those big guns, to keep those tanks greased and running and all that. And so they don't have that money, and they don't maintain them well. And so then when they deploy them in the field, they pose a danger to the community, like that Oakdale. You know, these guys go out with big guns. They go into a neighborhood with children. They don't do they don't look the property over before they do their seizure. They don't see that there's children's things in the backyard. They don't examine even the guy's record to know that he's never had any kind of criminal violation in his life. But yet they think they need these big guns to enter the house and shoot the dog or accidentally discharge a round that goes through 5 neighboring houses. So that's the problem. The federal government is a problem. The federal government using the leverage of our tax money to corrupt our police agencies and give them all this stuff and stir up all this testosterone where they want to have these big tanks and so that they can show their muscle. It's just ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, I understand, the role of the federal government in donating surplus equipment and, the increasing number of drug raids and paramilitary drug raids. But, I'm curious if you and Peter could speak to sort of the thought process of, say, a police chief in a 50-man department, right, who has been on the job, say, 30 years, certainly has a historical perspective to understand that this is not how policing was done 30 years ago. Why does that happen? Is it something fundamental about the way the police view the public? Is there a breakdown of trust? Why that dramatic change in tactic? I understand the federal government and the drug war, but why is that happening sort of in how police view themselves and their job?
I think we've created, thanks to Nixon. I look at Nixon sitting there deciding he wanted to do something to divert attention from himself, so he decided to get involved in the drug issue. And I have this vision of them sitting around in the office deciding what they're going to call this thing, and somebody saying, "Why don't we call it the new prohibition?" And somebody else saying, "Oh, no, don't use that word. Everybody in America knows that doesn't work. But let's call it a war on drugs." And what we have done is we have turned military by using those terms. The terms are very important. You talk about changing drug policy or ending the drug changing our prohibition policy, and that's a correction. That's a change. You mentioned ending the war on drugs, and people respond to you with war metaphors. They say that's surrender, that's giving up. And our law enforcement predominantly still is male, and you got these young men out there with these toys to play with, and then you tell them that it's okay if they play with the toys, and you give them a whole bunch of toys, they're going to play with them. They're just human beings.
I think that a lot of the culture that's been built into law enforcement since Nixon's announcement on drugs is if you look at the ratcheting up process, every year we look at the seizures and all the metrics having to do with the war on drugs, and every year it's a failure, and of course they have to know it's a failure, and so what they do is they ratchet it up. So they ratchet it up with legislation, let's give military equipment, they ratchet it up with cop grants, they ratchet it up with task forces, they ratchet it up with fusion centers and intelligence sharing. They deploy task forces all over the country, and they ratchet it up with a mandatory minimum sentencing and 3 strikes laws and building more prisons. And the mantra is always tough on crime, tough on crime, tough on crime. Well, it's easy, and especially politically, it's easy to say, let's slam these suckers in jail, let's lock them up, let's put them away, and the public responds emotionally, rah, 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 the politicians get elected. And nobody has said to them, I think it's starting to be heard now, let's stop this nonsense of being tough on crime, and let's start being smart on crime. Let's stop this nonsense of this concept of zero tolerance. I made the statement the other day before a group. I said a red flag should go up anytime a person in a position of responsibility utters the word zero tolerance, because that means they do not have the confidence to make a decision in their discipline. They do not have the compassion to see the differences between situations, and they do not have the administrative or managerial skills to make the kind of decisions that create a thriving institution. And man, these people are using zero tolerance at the drop of a hat. The head of the DEA, the head of the DEOJ, the politicians. And we have to steer that conversation away from being tough on crime to being smart on crime. And I think that's the culture that's been created over these years. And I think that's why you have chiefs of police that get their back up and say, we got to put these guys in jail, because they have transitioned to begging for federal money across the country. They're criticized if they don't get so many grants every year. And it's completely destroyed the concept of the peace officer in our communities. I always say peace officers don't have enemies. Everybody a peace officer comes in contact with is entitled to the protections of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And they've completely forgotten that. They wink at it.
It's interesting when you say that. I was a senior field training officer before I started getting promoted. And the last day of my session with people, I would tell them that understand one of the most important things about our job, and that is that every time you arrest somebody, you're arresting your boss. And that's a little different way to look at it. One other thing I want to throw in real quick. We've mentioned prisons a bunch of times here so far, and I just want to mention 2 things about prisons. One is 90% of the people that we have locked up in this country have one thing in common, and that is they are coming home. Only 10% of the people we lock up are in there for life. The rest of them are coming back. And you have to ask yourself, when they come back, do you want them coming back better than they went away or worse? Right now, we're sending them back worse than they went away. And the second thing I want to mention about prisons, because I never let the word prison be said in my presence without me saying this, and that is we have the largest and one of the most efficient prison systems on the planet, and we in America do not have one drug-free prison in America. And if you can't keep drugs out of prison, who is going to believe that drug-free school sign the next time they read it?
1 hour south of me in Colorado, in Fremont County, is the largest penal colony on the planet. This is America.
Yeah, Lenny, I was wondering if you could address the and Mike as well, some of the the legal issues surrounding that as what we've been discussing, the militarization of police. I mean, is there a limit? I mean, obviously, Posse Comitatus Act from post-Reconstruction, the military can't be used for domestic law enforcement. But I mean, is there a distinction there if the tactics and the equipment used by law enforcement, right, are identical to those used by the military? I mean, is there any level of force that the police could not use in serving a warrant against a nonviolent drug offender?
I think it is a little misleading to criticize the choice of weaponry. I think to the extent that a modern police officer can be faced with some serious weaponry in, say, a bank robbery, as we learned with the famous disastrous FBI shootout in California, don't blame the weapons. It's the training and the application. A surgeon may have a saw to chop body parts off in their arsenal, but they don't use it much. Don't take their saw away. Just aim it in the proper direction, and we're not doing that now. On the prison subject, legally, in my 37 years of practicing law and teaching and lecturing and writing, I have yet to come across a single example of conflict of interest that is more obscene, more egregious, more shocking than the fact that a private prison could even exist in the free world, let alone in America. It's beyond my ability, and I like to think I have a good command of words, and I don't have a word for how bad and wrong this is.
Absolutely.
One of the arguments for prison privatization, of course, is cost. Right? I mean, as with other privatization of other historically government-controlled functions. So, how do we scale that back? I mean, is there any possibility in the future of scaling back the growth of private prisons? Now that money has become part of that, lobbying has become part of that process of how prisons are built and where and how they're staffed. I mean, are we at the point of no return with regard to how prisons are run, or is there anything that can be done to dismantle that system?
The only way a private prison system can ethically be run is if the contract is upside down and they are paid more to have fewer people incarcerated, as opposed to the Motel 8 model, which is fill every room you have so that you can build more rooms next door.
Right.
Well, that's of course what keeps this concept of tough on crime and mandatory minimum sentencing and three strikes laws. That's what keeps all of that alive, because those private prison CEOs lobby Congress to keep those kinds of laws alive so they can keep their prisons full.
Unbelievable.
And it should be illegal. It should be a crime to start with for anybody in the business of private prisons to lobby Congress. But this is this thing across the board. Look what we've started in the Middle East with mercenary organizations like Blackwater. Don't you think that Blackwater is now being deployed in the United States? Don't you think that since we've passed the most recent national the Military Appropriations Act, where we are allowing now for the military to operate on American soil, and we are allowing now for United States citizens taken from American soil to be held in a Guantanamo environment without representation or due process? Don't you think that the next ratcheting up of the war on drugs, if it hasn't been done secretly already, is to transfer drug enforcement to the military and outsource it to outfits like Blackwater across the United States?
Now I'm going to have nightmares.
Well, you should be having nightmares, because it's all there. It's all there ready to go. The law is there. They're going to do it, and they're going to say it's legal, just like what they're doing with intelligence gathering now. They say it's legal because we made this bizarre interpretation of the law. That's what's happening. And they have done nothing with this drug war for 40 years but ratchet it up. They haven't stopped to look and think and act like civilized human beings. They've just ratcheted it up. Build more prisons, lock up more people, destroy more communities. And that's what the drug war is doing. And unless something happens that we stop it. And maybe our tipping point with marijuana is going to help get us there. It's going to get worse. Just today, I read the DEA is now ordering armored car companies not to pick up cash at legal medical marijuana dispensaries. How tyrannical can that be? It's something that it's really an edict. If that directive was written by petty thugs, you'd understand it. But it's written by one of the most powerful agencies of the U.S. government. They're creating crime in our communities by doing things like that.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, Mike, you mentioned earlier that kind of getting back to that issue, the conflict between federal and state marijuana laws. And, you know, it's interesting that the federal government really hasn't made legal challenges on preemption grounds to those laws, but they're continuing to enforce the federal law, if anything, more vigorously, both through, you know, direct enforcement, civil asset forfeiture, as well as the IRS, right, tax laws and those sorts of things. And now what Stephen was mentioning with the regulated armored truck companies. I was wondering if you could talk about how you see that playing out. I mean, ultimately, it seems that, you know, there's a difference between the state law and federal law on this issue that only seems to be expanding because, you know, it seems clear that most successful drug law reforms are going to occur at the state level before we see any real movement at the federal level. I was wondering if you could talk about that. I mean, how is that going to play out? Will Colorado and Washington be free to enforce their laws as the voters wish? Or do you see the federal government intervening?
Yeah, you know, I think with the medical marijuana issue especially, you know, I think that the change is going to have to come from the federal level. And I think you mentioned that, you know, oftentimes we see the change starting at the state level, and that's what we've seen with medical marijuana. But now we're at the point where something needs to be done federally, because Washington and Colorado can legalize marijuana. They can, you know, create a mechanism for distribution and taxation. But when it comes down to it, as long as the federal government considers marijuana a Schedule I controlled substance, and as long as they continue to enforce marijuana laws, then, you know, really it's going to be extremely difficult for these states to move forward with, you know, the different laws that they've put into place. So I mean, I think really what we're looking at is some type of reclassification or declassification on the federal level, and the freedom for states that have, you know, put into place marijuana or medical marijuana related laws, you know, the freedom for them to be able to legislate and operate independent of federal laws or federal intervention when it comes to marijuana. And I think that that's going to be extremely important. You know, we see it in California with medical marijuana all the time, and you know, we can do what we want with medical marijuana, but when it really comes down to it, the feds still have the power to come in. They still have the power to raid, to prosecute, to forfeit, and it makes it very difficult. It frustrates the idea that the states have a certain level of power to legislate for the health and safety of their citizens, and the federal government's essentially taking that away from us.
This will not be decided in the courts by the Fed suing the states or any of the states suing the Fed. It's already been decided by the voters, which is all the elected officials care about. They're the ones that are the bosses. So right now, the DEA keeps doing what the DEA does because they're continuing to do what they do and nobody's telling them not to. The politicians will absolutely, I promise, respond to the polling and the electorate. They will be forced to back off. They'll do it with a whimper, not a bang. It'll just gradually fade away, and sadly and painfully for those who are losing lives, property, and getting convictions where all they had was an addiction, we're in a transition period. We're at the event horizon of this new reality. It's a paradigm shift. So if you say what's going to happen next week, tough question. If you ask me what's going to happen in 5 years, we won't be having this discussion because I believe the feds won't be staging these guerrilla war tactics to just continue doing what they're doing because that's what they do.
Yeah, you know, in 20 years, I think we're going to be looking back on this as a civil rights issue, and we're going to be just ashamed that our country has been locking up people for marijuana-related offenses. I mean, you know, in many cases, what we're doing is we're depriving people of medicine. You know, they've gone through dozens of different types of medications to treat their symptoms, and then maybe they're taking 7 different pills. And most recently, the article, the documentary by Dr. Sanjay Gupta with CNN, and he followed a young individual who had seizures and was on several different medications. And, all it took was marijuana to reduce the number of seizures from a couple hundred a month to about 2 or 3. And, really what we're doing by criminalizing marijuana use is we're depriving people of a medicine in many cases that can help them. And it's just, there's something needs to be changed, and we're going to be looking back on this. And, everyone that's on the front lines of this movement that are fighting to legalize marijuana and other drugs, we're going to, there's going to be a lot. I think we're going to be looked at in a very favorable light in the future when we look back on this movement and on everything that's taken place.
Our government action is going to be looked back on with shame and embarrassment that we had a government behaving the way our government is behaving. And at the end of the day, I don't think the buck stops at the president's desk. I think the buck stops with the civilians, with the citizens. I think, gentlemen, the buck stops here.
And, I certainly agree with regard to marijuana, but I think that it's a more difficult argument with regard to other drugs for people who really haven't looked at the issue more broadly as, the failure of prohibition and the inability of the government to successfully regulate adult consensual behavior. So say 10-year time frame, 5-year time frame, and the war on marijuana is looked back as kind of silly. Do you see that as paving the way forward for a regulated system of legalization for other drugs? Or do you think the public perceives that so distinctly that those efforts will continue?
The single most important fact I see is this. People are seeing that in Colorado, just because marijuana is legal, people who were smoking before are smoking now, and people who were not smoking before are not taking it up. It makes it much easier for us to explain what we've been explaining, that if heroin goes on sale at Walmart tomorrow in an hour, we're not all going to drop off the show to get there on time to take advantage of the sale. It doesn't change the addict population, or in the case of marijuana, the user population, by much at all, and marijuana is demonstrating that.
Well, with the other drugs, we're really, I think organized crime is going to be a large focus. And when we look at how we're fueling violence in so many different countries by allowing our citizens to purchase drugs off the black market, I think that's going to be another controlling factor. And I think with marijuana, we can look at it and say, it's not a harmful drug. It's silly to have it be an illegal Schedule I controlled substance. But when you look at other drugs, maybe you can't make the same arguments. But I think one of the important arguments is going to be that by having these illegal substances and sending money, the drugs come here, the money goes back to these other countries, it fuels organized crime, it causes deaths, countless deaths because of it. Really all that it takes is the government stepping in, regulating this industry, and then you're not going to have the same black market sales. Someone mentioned earlier, you can't buy Jim Beam on the playground, and that's absolutely the case. People, even the marijuana dispensaries here, they're not selling to minors. They're not going to risk their operation, their employees, all these patients that they help out by selling to someone who's underage or someone who doesn't have a card. The liquor store, people that own liquor stores, they're not risking their license. They're not risking their jobs by, for the most part, by selling to underage people. And I think you're going to see the same thing with a regulated drug system in the United States.
Lenny, when you were saying that about people using, you got to remember that terrible tragedy when we ended alcohol prohibition and we fell into a drunken stupor. The whole country became alcoholics and we lost World War II. I mean, come on.
The carnage on the roads overnight was unbelievable. The roads became impassable. Nobody showed up for work the next day because they were all either hungover or getting drunk again.
Yeah.
It was horrible. I know. I wasn't born and I remember it like it wasn't yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because the anti-repeal people, that's exactly what they said would happen.
With that said, Peter, let me jump right in here and remind people that this is the 2013 Global Hemp Summit, and you are listening to it on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. We have concluded the first hour of this particular conference. We have one more yet in this series, and we ask that you take this material to the leaders of your community and send the MP3s to your senators, your congressmen, and all the leaders of the UN. Well, we're going to fade out here with some music and remind you that there is another hour of this broadcast to enjoy that's been given to us, thankfully, by AmericanFreedomRadio.com.
Look at all that money, oh, the money that they've spent. Take another look and take some time for hemp. Don't cut trees for paper, 'cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, well, it's time for hemp. Oh, an acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison our soil. The plastic made from the resin of hemp is far more durable than the steel we've bent.
It's the biodegradable alternative to the toxic petrochemical derivative.
So I think it's time to form a new industry.
Help heal the planet with a plant you see.
Like Tommy J said, it's the first necessity.
So grind it and combine it with the food we eat.
So many different ways it can lift us up.
Free hemp planet and refuse to corrupt. Free hemp planet and refuse to corrupt. Free hemp planet and refuse to corrupt. What's up?
People got